We're continuing on Shulchan Aruch Orach Chaim, the Chot Shabbat, and we're the tail end of Siman Resh Ayin Dalit, the halachot of B'siyat HaPat on Shabbat. Maran writes in Seif Dalit, well, Seif Gimel, I think also we left off last time. Maran writes in Seif Gimel, Ena mesubim rashayim lit'om. The people around the table are not allowed to eat the bread that they are given from the Baal HaBayit until the person who said the bracha has tasted. So therefore, halachically turns out to be that lechatchila when you say hamotzi, even though that you want to very efficiently and quickly pass the bread to everyone else, you should take a little piece of what you cut for yourself and start the eating process as you cut and give to other people. This way they could immediately have the challah that they are given as well. By the way, this also indicates that you should not be saying your own hamotzi. You should be yotzeh with the bracha of the Baal HaBayit, not just because of Berov Ab Hadrat Melech, but because you don't have Lechem Mishneh. Every person is obligated to have Lechem Mishneh, and if you don't say it with yourself, if you don't say it with the Baal HaBayit, rather, you say it for yourself, then you have lost that opportunity, unless you have, of course, your own Lechem Mishneh. You have your own double bread, which sometimes, again, it happens to be the right thing to do in a communal Seudah Shlishit, when you have to wait a lot between washing and saying hamotzi. If you would want to wait for the person who's going to say it for the tzibur, so if you have enough chalot on the table, you say it for yourself, and that is fine. But every person needs to be yotzeh the chiyuv av lechem mishneh on Shabbat. So Sif Dalet Maran writes, Seudah zu v'shel shacharit. We're talking, of course, about kiddush and hamotzi on Friday night. So Maran writes, this seudah, referring to Friday night seudah, Leil Shabbat, and the one of the morning, the shel shacharit, i'efshar la'asotam belo pat. You cannot do it without bread. You must have bread within the first two seudot of Shabbat. Now, this, even though that it indicates that the Seudah Shlishit you could do without pat, really is more complicated than it meets the eye, because if you take a look at later on, Siman Resh Tzadi Aleph, Seif Hey, Maran there writes, Sarich la'asota bepat. You must do Seudah Shlishit also with bread. V'yesh omrim she'achol la'asota bechol ma'achal ha'asui mechad b'chamesh haminim. There are those who say you could do it with the other items made from grain, aka mezonot, as well as bread. So it's not a must have with bread. V'yesh omrim, and there even those, this is the shita of the Tosafot, that they hold that you could do it even b'dvarim shemlaftim b'hem et hapat, b'basar v'dagim, aval lo b'perot. Right, there's a third shita that you could do it even with meat and with fish and so on. And there is even the shita of the Ran that's most lenient, that you could do Seudah Shlishit even with fruits and vegetables. And Maran ends up saying v'sevara rishona ikar. The first thing that we mentioned is the ikar halacha shesarich la'asota bepat. Right? That you must do it with bread, unless you are mamash full and you can't have more, so then it becomes a different question. So even though that Maran over here indicates clearly that Seudah Shlishit is not a must-have, a pat, is only because of the four-way machloket harishonim that he brings in the halachot of Seudah Shlishit in Siman Resh Tzadi Aleph Seif Hey. But the psak halacha, as we just moments ago saw, is that you have to have bread also with Seudah Shlishit. It's not a free-for-all that you could just choose not to have Seudah. You must have Seudah, unless obviously the extenuating circumstances which would call for extreme measures of leniency, which you would be lenient. So says the Mishna Berura over here by us, Rotze lomar he actually brings this up, that even according to those Rishonim who are a little bit more lenient when it comes to Suda Shlishit, still, be'elu shte seudot modu kule alma. This, the first and the second Suda, is not a debate. Everybody agrees that you're mechuyav to have Suda with pat, and therefore Maran says it in a simplistic way over here, and waits until he gets to the halachot of Suda Shlishit. Dehem ikar kavod Shabbat. The first two Sudot is the ikar kavod Shabbat, and therefore everyone agrees that you have to have bread. Im yesh le'onis she'enu yachol lekayim Sudat Arvit. If you have a situation in which you can't do Sudat Arvit, you don't have bread, you just had steak and other good food, but you didn't have bread, what do? So, of course, we understand. But can you make it up? And the halakha is yes. You can and you should make it up. That means tomorrow morning you'll have 3 sudas instead of 2. You'll have 3 sudot during the day of Shabbat instead of having 1 at night. You could make it up during the course of Shabbat, which tells you a chidush that the concept of 3 sudot on Shabbat is exactly that. It's a concept. So if you missed it earlier on during the Friday night, you make it up during the day. Now, the Rashba writes that having a Suda Shlishit, 3 Sudot on Shabbat, is a mitzvah d'Rabbanan. It's not midoraita. You don't have to have a Suda necessarily. Chacham actually brings a whole list of Rishonim in Yabia Omer, in Chelek Dalit of Yabia Omer in Orach Chaim. He says that that's the basic halacha. That's not midoraita, even though that it is included in the pasuk of Zachor et Yom Shabbat lekadesho. Still, it is for kavod and kedushat Shabbat, and it's only a mitzvah d'Rabbanan, not necessarily anything that is midivrei Kabbalah or deoraita. Again, this becomes a larger part of what we discussed in the very beginning of Chelek Gimel of Shulchan Aruch, in the beginning of Hilchot Shabbat, whether or not mitzvah of Oneg Shabbat is considered midivrei Kabbalah, midrabbanan, midoraita. That's something that we segued into this sugya as well, whether or not it's considered deoraita. Now you have to have pat. Can you have pat haba bekisnin? Right? Can you have mezonot instead of seuda? Right? So there are those. For instance, the Sefer Ikarei Adat, he writes in Siman Yud Gimel. He brings from other earlier achronim that you are yotzeh with pat haba bekisnin even in Seuda Rishona and Shnia, even in the first 2 Seudot of Shabbat. Right? Maran Chida disagrees with that in his Sherod Utshuvot Yosef Ometz. Maran Chida writes not like that. He says a person cannot be yotzeh his obligation, he fulfilled the obligation of Seuda Rishona, the first and second Seuda of Friday night and Shabbat morning, with pat haba bekisnin, with mezonot, with things of cakes and cookies and so on. This is in Siman Memchet of Tshuvot Yosef Ometz. So that stays obviously as a machloket. This machloket has its ramifications in other areas of Hilchot Shabbat, which is beyond the scope of this little talk over here. But nevertheless, the halacha l'maaseh would be that the person must have bread both at the Friday night Suda and on Shabbat morning Suda as well. Now, if a person has to fast on Shabbat, if, for instance, you imagine you have to take a blood test and you have to be fasting for proper results of the blood test, and therefore, and it's something important that he has to do, so he has to not eat on Shabbat, right? So what happens with that? The Rashba, Magen Avraham brings from Rashba, the fasting on Shabbat is Isur Doraita, right? You can't just decide that today I'm not going to be eating, okay? So how do you do it? Oh, well, first of all, for blood test, water does not necessarily ruin the blood test. So for those who don't know, So you could actually have water. Sometimes you can even have other things other than water, even a coffee or whatnot. You can ask your local Orthodox doctor in that scenario. But obviously, based on what we just mentioned right now, it's easy. You could have 2 sudot on Friday night and 1 later on Shabbat afternoon, and you'll be good to go. Just make sure you have a little sip of water, not too fast, based on this Rashba that we just mentioned, and you basically, it's a puzzle that you can rearrange to make sure you have done everything that's needed to be done.
You do all 3 on Friday night?
Well, do you necessarily need to? If it's a good question, because Shabbat morning it has its own criteria of obligation. But again, if a person absolutely cannot have anything, because they're going to be having, let's say, a surgery on Shabbat, and then you're going to be out, you're going to be sedated in induced coma or whatnot, and they're not going to be able to do it. Yeah, if you could do that, especially in a winter night like this, that you have 6-7 hours of Friday night. Yeah, it certainly is better than not doing it. That would be what to do.
Do you have to have food before Chatzot?
Yes, in order not to be considered halachically fasting, it will be before Chatzot. So this actually becomes a very important thing, because many people who daven a little later, they may be waking up a little later during the day, especially in the winter time. The Chatzot is very early; it's like 11:30. It's Chatzot already. So a regular minyan even would end up being very close, if not past Chatzot. And once you daven, you can't eat or drink. So if you don't take advantage of the time between waking up and davening, when it becomes asur to drink, well, that by itself is question, it's shacharit or musaf, but then you have fasted basically the entire day until Chatzot, which becomes a problem. So therefore, it's important to wake up a little earlier. You could have a little coffee. The Pelei Yoetzer, Eliezer Papa writes, what a chaval it is for people who wake up late. They miss on learning in the morning, saying Tikkun Chatzot, and they miss on having a nice coffee. He says, well, which rejuvenates you, and then you come to Tefillah with Yeshuv Hadas properly, to jump into Tefillah, waking up 5 minutes before, getting dressed halfway, and coming to the shul is not the way to go, says Rabbi Eliezer Papa in Pelei Yoetzer. But nevertheless, one of the things that you gain certainly on Shabbat is that having a coffee or a tea before Shacharit saves you from this problem, because you're no longer now fasting, and you could go through the tefillah properly and not to have to rush or not to get stuck with a situation in which you have fasted and transgressed this issue. Says the Mishna Berura, provided this issue that we mentioned, that you're going to have the 3 seudot on Shabbat day, if you can do on Shabbat, ובלבד שיקדש בלילה ויאכל מיד אחר הקידוש כזית מחמשת המינים. At the very least, you have to be יוצא דחיוב אב kiddush b'makom seudah, which means you say kiddush on your cup of wine or grape juice, and then you have a kazayit of mezonot at the very least, or a revi'it of wine from the cup, and then it would be fulfilled your basic obligations. Now, can you have a seudah of bar mitzvah together with seudat Shabbat? Yeah, you can, because it's not an issue of enosim mitzvot chavilot that you're doing mitzvot piles and piles of them together. So you could have masechet, bar mitzvah, seudat brit milah together with seudat Shabbat. You don't have to add another seudah. Say, well, I'm going to have 3 seudot of Shabbat, and then I'm going to add the seudah bar mitzvah or brit milah or siyum masechet. It doesn't have to be its own thing. You could combine them together, and that's not considered enosin mitzvot chavilot. In any case, yes.
What if it's Yom Tov, Shabbat, and the Bar Mitzvah?
Still, no problem.
Stack 3?
Yeah, it's not a problem of enosin mitzvot chavilot. So that basically concludes our Siman Resh Ayin Dalet. We're going to jump into the first Seif of Siman Resh Ayin Hey, as well, Dvarim Hasurim Laso Deot Shabbat. What things you can't do with a candle on Shabbat. Now, you have to understand that back in the day, before the electricity, the light provided on Friday night especially was purely through candles. So you were using the light of candles, and that's the whole background to the mitzvah of Adlakat Ner Shabbat, as we mentioned before, because of Shalom Bayit, that you want to have light in any space in your house that you will be using and you will be walking. It's not just my dining room. We spoke about, Makom Seudah, especially Al Pi Kabbalah, being the main place that you light your candles. But we also mentioned that it's a mitzvah to have a ner daluk, a light in every room and a space that you're going to be using on Friday night, because you don't want to bump into things and fall over yourself and so on and so forth. That would not be pleasant on Shabbat. Therefore, the mitzvah, even nowadays, the mitzvah includes making sure there's light everywhere in the house that you're going to be using. Enough light. Now, nowadays it's easier because the luminance that we have are much stronger, and also you have residual light that penetrates the house from outside. From the street, just the street lights by itself is sufficient oftentimes. And also, if you have a light in the bathroom, you open the door a little bit and you have enough light penetrating inside the room. Therefore, that becomes less of an issue, but still something to be mindful of. Now, when you have candles, how do you operate the needs that you have? Can you do just about anything? And this sometimes becomes actually relevant. I remember still one of the hurricanes in the East Coast when I was in yeshiva, and the entire campus of the yeshiva, which is far from the lights of any other place, but the entire neighborhood had a blackout because thousands of trees had fallen. Many of the cables were cut off, and electricity was not available for complete regions in the city for the entire Friday night. Right, this happened right before Shabbat, and we're going into Shabbat. You had nothing but candles. So you came into the Bet Midrash, it looked very interesting. Like you had hundreds of candles lit in the Bet Midrash as they're doing Kabbalat Shabbat and Arvit, right? So what can and can't you do when you are finding yourself in that situation? And Pauline says, the Shulchan Aruch, which means you don't look for lice, any other creatures that you want to clean your head or your clothing from. This again is a reality that they lived with. Where Hashem, we don't have that reality the same way nowadays. And you can't also learn inside a sefer in the light of a candle, right? Can't do that. Even if you're not reading out loud, you still can't read, because what happens when you're reading, and then you get into it and you forget that's Shabbat, and you'll go grabbing the light to bring it a little closer or to tilt it a little bit, and that would cause the addition havara that you're causing, which is a Isur Doraita, would be a problem, right? Again, the Gemara says, Rabbi Ishmael said, Ani ekra velo ate. I will read and it won't happen to me. Nothing's going to happen to me, right? I will be very careful and mindful. And he started reading the Or HaNer on Shabbat, and sure enough, like whenever you go against the nature of the world or the spiritual nature of the world, which is Divrei Chazal, twisting the fabric of nature will always snap back. It will chase after you until it catches you alone in an alleyway and gets back at you, the reality of the world. That's how it works. And sure enough, the great, mighty Rabbi Ishmael made the mistake of doing hataya, this very thing, and he wrote in his private pinkas, he said, Ani, Ishmael, I, so and so, karati ve'iteti, this happened to me, and when the Bet HaMikdash will be built, I would have to bring chatat shemina, I would have to bring a korban chatat for what I transgressed and violated. So says the Shulchan Aruch, even if you're reading just in your mind, still would be prohibited shemayate, because you may come to tilt and to use the ner and move it around. And this is like any other gezerah of Chazal, that once they make a gezerah, there's no difference. Even if the light is 10 stories high, right? The candle is 10 stories high, it will be still asur, even though that you can't reach it, you can't touch it, still would be asur, because like all the other gezerot of Chazal, it's lo peluk. They did not differentiate between the cases. Even if it's in a glass jar, it's closed behind glass, and you can't touch it necessarily, or kavua, or if it is set and sealed, basically, bechol shabakot in the hole that's in the wall, still would be asur, and even will be the same with ner shava, with a paraffin candle, or then that would be the modern equivalent, or they had the wax candles that hataya doesn't do anything to them. It doesn't make more, fuel come to the wick. Still would be still asur. So that is the gist of this, and B'ezrat Hashem, the details of this seif that we just read, we will discuss in the days to come. Hazaku Baruch.